Good morning. Today, Pastor Peter Chin will share the message from the book of Luke, chapter 19, verses 1 through 10. Zach will read in Indonesian and I will read in English. Hear the word of the Lord.
Ketika Yesus sampai di Yeriko, ia berjalan terus melintasi kota itu. Di kota itu ada seorang kepala penagih pajak yang kaya, namanya Zacchaeus. Ia ingin melihat siapa Yesus itu, tetapi karena orang terlalu banyak dan ia sendiri pendek, maka ia tidak berhasil melihat Yesus. Jadi ia berlari mendahului orang-orang, lalu memanjat sebatang pohon supaya dapat melihat Yesus yang sebentar lagi akan lewat di situ. Ketika Yesus sampai di pohon itu, ia melihat ke atas lalu berkata, "Zacchaeus, turunlah cepat, sebab aku harus berkunjung ke rumahmu hari ini." Zacchaeus cepat-cepat turun dan menyambut Yesus dengan gembira.
Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly.
Semua orang yang melihat hal itu mulai menggerutu. Mereka berkata, ia pergi bertamu di rumah orang yang tidak baik." Kemudian di rumahnya, Zacchaeus berdiri dan berkata kepada Yesus, "Tuhan, separuh dari harta saya akan saya sedekahkan kepada orang yang miskin. Dan siapa saja yang pernah saya tipu, akan saya bayar kembali kepadanya 4 kali lipat." Lalu kata Yesus, "Pada hari ini engkau dan seluruh keluargamu diselamatkan oleh Allah dan diberikan hidup yang baru, sebab engkau juga keturunan Abraham. Anak manusia datang untuk mencari dan menyelamatkan orang yang sesat."
All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He has gone to be the guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Thank you, Steve and his family. Good morning, everyone. Again, so glad you could join us for our worship service today. Before I start with the sermon, I did want to let you know something we're going to be doing next week. Next Sunday, we're going to have a special dialogue and conversation here at RAC. Adrian Diaz, who is the interim Seattle Police Department police chief, will be joining us for our service. Adrian's been here a few times. We've talked to him about community. We also had him here when we were addressing the death of Charlena Lyles a few years ago, and so he's been a frequent participant in our services before. We're glad to have him. But we're also going to have Sean Good, who is the husband of Kim Good and the executive director of Choose 180, which is a program that really specializes in restorative justice and giving youth a different pathway in terms of their life. And so we wanted to have both of them here to talk about what does it look like for a community to get involved in justice and restoration and community policing, so that we can begin to see the different perspectives on what that looks like from the perspective of the police department versus community leaders. What are some of the intersection points and the points of similarity? What are some of the things that aren't similar, that do not match up between these perspectives? And so this will be, I think, a really important question that we need to address, but I really love the spirit in which we're addressing it, that both Sean and Adrian know each other well, have worked together on multiple levels. We've worked both with the SBD and with Choose 180 and Community Passageways and multiple organizations as well. And so we're really looking at this as a dialogue and not a debate, not to see who can win, who has a better argument, but instead to really begin to talk and to synergize, begin to brainstorm and imagine what does it look like for us to move forward in terms of more just and a more peaceful community altogether, all the partners or some of the partners that are involved in that. So we hope that you will join us next week for that special conversation with these great leaders. Today, for our sermon, we are talking about grace, and our approach to this conversation really has been that grace is so fundamental and so important to Christians, but at the same time so difficult to understand, difficult to internalize, and difficult to practice. And so we have that tension between an incredibly important topic, but also one that we really struggle with in terms of living out. And I think today's conversation is a perfect example of that tension. And in order to illustrate it, I wanted to tell a story from a book. It's called White Picket Fences, written by Amy Julia Becker. And it seems on the surface as a very standard illustration of grace, of a gift that God gave. And in that story, Amy Julia Becker relates how her husband was looking for a position at a school, and he was in personal relationship with someone, and because of that relationship, he was able to breeze through the hiring process really with no hindrances or hiccups and be hired almost on the spot. And they really give thanks to God for this. They felt like this was grace. This was a gift to them that God had given them this position, and so they were just really thankful for this. And I think many of us have had experiences very similar to this. But what they discovered later was that other people in the school were not as happy about this because they felt like this was not actually grace, but instead that he had secured this position because of his advantages. That as a well-educated white male who had good personal connections and relationships with people, he had a leg up on that position versus anyone else, and in fact didn't have to go through the whole process. So really what in fact had given him this role and had given him access to this role was not grace, it was actually privilege. It was advantages and benefits that he had that other people did not have that positioned him better than anyone else. And they really struggled with this. They struggled with this question. Wait, what is this? Is this God's gift to us that we have this position? Or did we really get this because of unfairness? Because of inequity, that there were advantages that he had that other people did not possess? That is the question, the tough question that I want us to address today. How can we tell the difference between a blessing we receive from God, which we would call grace, and an advantage that we possess that others do not? How do we begin to differentiate between the two? By something that legitimately comes from God versus a benefit or an advantage that we have that's not really from God. It's by virtue of an unjust or unequal culture or system that puts us at advantage at the expense of other people. How do we tell the difference between the two? And I want to make clear the perspective from which I am talking and addressing this subject. That I'm doing it really as someone who sees himself as a person of privilege. No, I'm not a white person, but I am a male, and so that already places me at advantage over some people. I am well educated. I have a comfortable lifestyle. I'm the leader of an organization, and so many aspects of my life reflect this idea that I have advantages or benefits over other people. I have a strong voice that I can speak on the internet about, and so I'm really looking at this from the perspective of someone who has and possesses a lot of privilege, not really the opposite. And so I just want to make that clear. That's really how I'm asking this question as one who has that kind of privilege. Before we go further, I do want to acknowledge what some of us might be feeling as we engage in this discussion or begin to broach this topic. And I think this picture might illustrate well how we feel. And that is, we feel like Tony Stark right here. Cue the eye roll as we talk about this. That as we begin to bring up privilege, our eyes roll to the very far corners of our head and we think to ourselves, do we have to go there? Right? We're talking about grace and somehow this turns into a conversation about privilege. How did we get here? Can we not just talk about grace and how good it is and not talk about what this means in terms of race and privilege and injustice? Why do we have to kind of put those two things together? And I just want to acknowledge it's a very natural way to feel. And I understand that kind of tiredness or maybe this feeling that these topics don't really go together. But a few reasons why I think we legitimately should be talking about the intersection and the difference between these two things. First is this. Here at RAC, we believe that ideas of spirituality should lead to justice and vice versa. This is a big part of our ministry. It's and the MO of our ministry, that we believe that justice and spirituality really are not separate, independent things, that you talk about spiritual stuff and then you stop and you break and then you talk about justice kind of stuff. But no, there's an intersection. That if we're true to spirituality, that will bring us to consider the good of other people. But the good of other people and the journey to that is so difficult and so heart-wrenching that we need to connect with God's heart. These things are swirled together. They are really two sides of one coin. And that is why we often talk about justice and spirituality. That's why Heather Otieno is our Justice and Spirituality Ministries Director, because we want to build our comfort level and our ability to go from one conversation to the other as a way for us to remember these things are connected to each other. And that's why we bring this up. This is very much a RAC kind of conversation. So if you're new to our church and you're wondering what we're about, this is a prototype of what we do. That we would say grace, the grace of Jesus that is so perfectly represented by the cross, should have some manifestation in the world and how we act in the world. So grace and privilege is very much a RAC conversation in my mind. So that's one reason. I think it's in our culture. But in a broader way, I think it's part of Christian culture as well. Another reason why I think we should be talking about this, that introspection and critical self-examination are normal practices for Christians. Yes, examining our privilege and our advantages over people is hard. We've got to look deeply in ourselves. We have to critically examine some of the benefits and really be able to say, are those blessings or are those advantages? We've got to take the time to look inside of ourselves and to be humble enough and self-aware enough to ask those kinds of questions and to answer them honestly. It's really hard work. And it's not easy to do. It's difficult, it's complex, it's nuanced, all these different things. But we have to recognize looking inside of ourselves and asking tough questions about our motivations and about our heart is not just a work of justice. It's not about critical race theory or Marxism or some kind of liberal thing. It's a Christian thing. This is what we read in Psalm 139. Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me and lead me in the way everlasting. Or what Paul writes in Romans chapter 12. Do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment in accordance with the faith God has distributed to each of you. Yes, privilege is tough, and it requires us to be humble and self-aware and critically examine ourselves, but those are Christian practices. Those are things that are not foreign for us. Those are things that come with the territory of being a Christian. And so as we engage with this, I think we really have to not say, this is a liberal kind of thing that we're talking about these things. No, this is a Christian mentality to look inside ourselves and say, wait, is there a wayward way in me? Test me, God. Why am I so anxious about this? And we need to stop labeling that as something the world is forcing us to do and to recognize these are practices and disciplines that are come back from time immemorial as followers of Jesus Christ. The third reason why I think we should be talking about grace and privilege and the tension between the two is that if we do not take time to recognize the difference between grace and privilege, we run the risk of mistaking the two. We run the risk of looking at an advantage that comes at someone else's expense, that comes out of unfairness and ultimately of sin, and saying, God, thank you for this thing. A good example of this came out earlier this year in this conversation that took place between a megachurch pastor and a Christian CEO and a Christian rapper, a black rapper. And they were talking about race, they were talking about racial injustice and reconciliation. And in that conversation, the pastor came up with a good point. And he was saying that the word privilege, just the term privilege, is so loaded and gets people so triggered that they can't even engage with the conversation. They can't even begin to think about the ways that they may have benefited from this. They're derailed, and they just can't even begin. And so he made that observation, and his solution was, why don't we use a different word? Let's call it something different that Christians are familiar with, and in that way, they can get a little deeper in this conversation. And so his suggestion in this conversation is, let's not use the word white privilege because that is so triggering and that gets people off in some rabbit trails. Let's call it white blessings instead. Let's call them white blessings. Let's call them blessings because they are good things that white people have had because of white supremacy, because of slavery. That's the language that Christians use. And so it gets around this idea of privilege and it allows them to explore some of the ways in which they have benefited from these things. And I get the intention and I understand what he's trying to do, and it makes sense in some ways, but in one way it's deeply problematic. And that way is this: if we call these advantages that people have because of supremacy, because of racism, because of slavery, blessings, we are in essence saying that God is okay with them, that God gave them. We're saying, God, thank you for these blessings that have come at the expense or even the blood of other people. And that is not a combination that I think we want to be comfortable with. That's saying these things that are ultimately sin, that yes, they advantaged people, but they advantaged people because other people became disadvantaged, and to say, God, thank you for this. Calling them white blessings is troubling, to say the least. There's another figure that I think we are intimately connected to as a Free Methodist Church who understood the problem with combining these two things and saw advantages of systems very different from blessings from God. And that is John Wesley. In 1774, John Wesley was challenged to consider the blessings of slavery. That people said, hey, slavery might be bad, people might be getting hurt, but let's look at the nation it's building. Let's see how it's cultivating these American colonies. These wild, untamed lands are becoming transformed because of slavery. Isn't that a good thing? And this was John Wesley's unequivocal response. It were better that all those colonies should remain uncultivated forever. Yea, it were more desirable that they were altogether sunk in the depth of the sea, that they should be cultivated at so high a price, at the violation of justice, mercy, and truth. They challenged John Wesley to imagine and to be open-minded about the blessings of enslaving one race of people over the others, and he said no. He said, it is better, you would never be advantaged in that way and never receive any benefit, and better that that land should die than you should do that to another person. And so he had this clear differentiation between the advantages of injustice and evil and God's blessings, and he would not merge the two. And we have to be able to do the same. That without recognizing the difference between grace and privilege, we run the risk of praising God for things that we should actually be lamenting or repenting for. if we don't take this time to critically examine our lives and our circumstances and the good things that we have, we might actually get into the practice of receiving a benefit that other people cannot, that other people may be pushed down so that we might be lifted up, and then turning to the cross and turning to God and saying, God, thank you for giving me this. Praise you for this blessing that you have given me while we have our foot on the back of another person. We need to ask this question so that we might never be giving God praise and worship and thanksgiving for something that we should actually be repenting for. This is a big conversation. It's an important one, and it might make us feel uncomfortable, but for these reasons, I think it's very appropriate that we go right into the heart of it. But there is a wall in our way. There is a huge stumbling block, like that pastor rightly pointed out, that derails us from even getting started with this, that is so emotionally damaging and triggering that we can't even get into it, and that is our fragility regarding privilege. That what often stands in the way of recognizing and addressing our privilege is our fragility. That talking about privilege makes us feel vulnerable and uncomfortable. And in that way, that pastor, although I don't agree with how he framed the idea of privilege, I definitely agree with his observation about how it derails people. That the moment you even begin to bring this up, there is this kind of visceral, deep response where people just cannot go any further. And I feel this way as well. I remember someone saying, because you went to an Ivy League school, that puts you in advantage of other people. And I got mad. And I said, what? Do you know how hard I worked to get into that school? Do you know how hard my parents worked as immigrants to get me into a position, to get into one of the best schools in this country? How dare you? How dare you say that I am privileged because I got into that place? And there was an allergic response, an allergy. I just started sneezing and coughing and hacking emotionally and spiritually at the very mentioning that I did not earn my place in this world. And I know many of us feel that. There is this deep vulnerability and discomfort and fragility that we have when it comes to addressing privilege, and it prevents us from even getting started. We can't even ask the question, much less recognize that it might be true, far less begin to address how its effects and reverse those effects, because we are so fragile. So we have to talk about that first. We've got to understand, where does this fragility come from? Why do you respond so emotionally and so viscerally when people call into question the fact that we've earned everything? I think it has to do with the fact that we find much of our identity and value in the Puritan or Protestant work ethic. The Puritan or Protestant work ethic is basically this. It's this idea that if you work hard, you can earn a better place in society and in life. That's the American dream, right? And it very much comes out of this idea that in the Western Europe, we can go back to the slide later. It comes out of this idea that in Europe, there were social classes. There was aristocracy. You were born into a class, and you couldn't work your way up or down. And so as a very liberal and a very new understanding of social class in the Americas, they said, no, there is no social class that's hard and fast, no caste system here. If you work hard, no matter if you're an immigrant and your whatever your background is, you can elevate yourself through work. This was a very liberal and a very new understanding of social class that came out of the 1600s and the 1700s and was lived out, became part of the American identity and the value system of a person. We are not valued because you are a noble or you're a merchant or whatever the case might be. You are valued because you work hard. In some ways, we can understand why that was such a powerfully revolutionary idea. But with that came another darker side, which is your value comes out of what you earn. that you're valuable because you have earned all that you have. And if you haven't earned it, you're not valuable. You have no worth. Because here in America, your value is determined that because you have earned everything that you've gotten. If you've been given a silver spoon, if you have been given any benefits, if you've been given a handout, you're worth nothing. Because that's not what our country is about. I think this is well illustrated by several phrases that we often say that I think are really reflections of how deeply seated this sense of identity and value is in our country. Phrases like this: no such thing as a free lunch. You shouldn't be getting anything for free. You should be working for everything that you have. The concept of being a self-made man, how everyone makes the claim to being a self-made man. You can be a supposed billionaire raking in a lot of money, and who got that because people gave it to you, or your father gave it to you, or whatever, and you can still say, I am a self-made man. It's such a common role and identity that we claim for ourselves. Or another more kind of gritty phrase, kill what you eat. I remember having lunch with some people who worked on the stock market in New York City, and I heard that phrase no less than 3 times. No less than 3 times they were saying, I kill what we eat. Here in this brokerage firm, we kill what we eat. Every dollar that we earned it. It's not given to us. They saw themselves as predators, as people who work hard for all the money that they have. The phrase, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. So many of us have heard that before, right? This idea that if you work hard, you should be able to elevate yourself out of any position. Right? Your value and your identity and your status can rise as a result of your work. Have you ever thought about this? That the very phrase, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, is supposed to be ironic in its nonsense? As you're standing there or sitting there, try to lift yourself off the couch by pulling up on your feet. If you're on your back, go ahead and lift yourself up by pulling on your shoelaces. How in the world does a person pull themselves up by their own bootstraps? It's physically impossible to do. The very idea is supposed to be ironic, that you cannot pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. But in the American mentality, we took that impossibility and we made it into a phrase, an aphorism for people. We said, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. We made it to an advice for people. Or this phrase, born with a silver spoon in your mouth. No one wants to be born with a silver spoon. I don't know if it's that popular of a phrase. I know that phrase because of Ricky Schroeder and silver spoons. Who's hearing me out there who knows that TV show? But that's something that no American wants to say. None of us wants to say, oh, I was born with a silver spoon. I was born into privilege, advantage, into wealth. No, we want to say that we've earned it. And some of us, I remember distinctly in college, a lot of people trying to hide their wealth because they did not want to seem like they were people who were born with a silver spoon in their mouth. This is where so many of us in America find our identity and our worth and our value, that we have earned everything that we have, that we are self-made people. We have had no handouts, and that is why we are who we are. That's why we're important. That's why we're valuable, because we have worked hard for it. And so if we worked hard and that's where we are, that's where we say, oh, I got here because I worked hard for it. But then you see why privilege damages us, why it hurts us. We struggle with privilege so much because we find so much of our identity and self-worth in the belief that we have earned everything, and privilege calls that into question. This is the reason why we have an allergic reaction to the conversation about privilege, because our value and our self-worth and our standing in the eyes of other people is based on the premise that I've earned it all. I worked hard to get where I am. Everything that I have and it is because I worked for it and I deserve it. And privilege whispers to us and it says, no, you didn't. Some of the things that you have, you didn't work for. You were given it because you're wealthy, because you're well-educated, because of the shade of your skin, because your hair, because of your eyes, because of your height, because you were ableist, whatever it might be. That's what privilege whispers to us. And it begins to pull down on our value, you see? Because our value is up here, because I worked hard, I earned everything. And privilege begins to pull that down. It begins to say, no, you did not. And our value and our identity and our self-worth gets dragged down at the same time. And that's why we react so much to it, because it begins to cut and it begins to undercut and wound us to the very core of where we find our value in our lives. Now we see why we hurt. Now we see that even an inkling, the mere suggestion that we have not earned everything, hurts us so badly, because it hurts us here. It hurts us in the core of why we think we are important and we matter in this country. But for a moment, let's put that American identity aside, and let's think about another aspect of our identity, which is our Christian identity, our identity as Christ followers. Where does that come from? What is that based out of? We talked about that for multiple weeks now, right? And we said it last week. We said that Christianity is not a faith about getting what you deserve. It's actually the exact opposite. Christianity is about getting what you did not deserve. It's about getting things that you did not earn. It's about getting good things while you were still sinners, receiving Jesus' life and death while we were enemies of Christ. That's what our faith is. Our identity as Christians is very different from the world. Our identity as Christians is not based on what we have earned, but what we have received freely, right? As Christians, we are not wage earners. We are not people who have earned what we have. We are gift receivers. We are people who have been given things free of charge while we were bad. God gave us His very best because He is good, not because we are good. That's who we are. Our very identity is found in that we have received gifts. That's who we are as Christians. If we know that, and if that is true, that radically begins to alter and change our approach and our response and our reaction to the idea of privilege. You see, if I find my identity and my value and self-worth and all the things that I've earned and I've done and I've worked hard for it, and privilege says, no, you didn't, then yes, my identity and my value and self-worth start to drop as I confront that fact. But this is the opposite. If our identity is instead found in grace, there is no need for us to be fragile in confronting privilege because we know all about possessing things that we did not earn. You see, on the flip side of that, if my identity is that I'm a gift receiver, I'm a recipient of grace, and I'm only here because God has been good and generous to me, when someone says to me here, you know, you didn't earn everything in your life, I can whisper back, I know. That's who I am. I'm all about that. My very life, my faith, my everything, my eternal value is found in having received gifts. You don't have to tell me I don't deserve everything. That's who I am. I'm a Christian. I've received grace in my life while I was a sinner. Privilege is not a big deal to me. I'm not challenged by this. I'm not hurt by the prospect I didn't earn something in my life because, hey, every day at church, every Sunday at church, that's what Pastor Peter tells me. I'm worthless. I'm not saying that, but basically what I'm saying is we don't have to struggle. We don't have to get mad about privilege because our value is not found in what we earned. There are many things in our lives we did not earn. What's one more thing ultimately? You see how grace radically transforms our reaction to this very difficult question. There's no better example of that dynamic than Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus is a man of incredible privilege. He is a man which in Jewish society puts him well above people. He is also wealthy in the city of Jericho, which makes him even more advantaged over people. And lastly, he has allied himself with the most powerful empire of all time, the Roman Empire. He is above other people, and he's gotten there on the backs of others. He has stolen from his own people, the Jews, in order to give to the occupying force, which is the Romans. He is privilege personified. He is above other people, and he got there by treading on others. And essentially, he gets called out. Essentially, in Luke chapter 19, the crowd begins to grumble or whisper to each other and really at him. And they say, "You don't deserve this. You don't deserve Jesus. You're a sinner. You stole from us. You're a collaborator with the Romans. You're terrible. You don't deserve any of this." They're basically calling him out for his advantages and how he got there, which is not too dissimilar for being called out, but for privilege. How does he respond? Does he respond with bitterness and anger and resentment, saying, "No, this is my job. You should do something with your own life. Don't blame me because I worked hard for this"? Does he get mad? Does he walk away? Does he respond in that kind of way that is so frequent for us? No. In verse 8, this is what he says. But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord," the kind of enthusiasm, "Look, Lord, here and now, no waiting, no later, I give half of all that I own to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." There is no grumbling. There is no anger. There is no resentment. There is no justification. He says in that moment where they call him out, "Oh, how do I make it right? Here, half my debts to the poor. If I've cheated anyone, 4 times the amount." He immediately acknowledges and recognizing what he has and how he got it, and he goes right to fixing it, right to paying reparations for it. What made that possible? How does he respond in this way from being called out as a sinner and as a person of advantage who has stolen from other people to instantaneously saying, "Yes, that's true, and let me make it right"? How does he do that? Does he do it because of the shame? Because of the guilt? Because how angry people got at him and how they heaped insults upon him? No. Because of grace. Zacchaeus' response is fueled not by guilt, but grace. Jesus has freely befriended him, so he can freely and even joyfully address his own misdeeds and go on to pay reparations. This is what we are talking about. Because he knew grace, it was no thing. It was nothing. Sorry, forgot the difference between no thing and nothing. It was nothing for him to say, "Oh, yeah, that is wrong. Let me make it right." Grace made that possible. Grace allowed him to take this accusation and this rebuke and to take it and say, "Oh, this is true. Let me make this right." Because he had the friendship of Jesus and he knew that he already had it. So what was it to him to make things right now when he had this gift? So it is with us. Grace allows us to recognize and address our privilege without diminishing our self-worth in the least, and then more naturally to go from people of privilege to people who dismantle it. Grace makes this possible. Grace allows us to say, I do have advantages. No big thing though, because God has already done that in my life. I'm not surprised by that fact. I'm not surprised by good things that I haven't earned. That's who I am. So maybe I have been advantaged. How do I need to make this right? What do I need to do to reverse this, to make sure that God's love is equally shared in this world? What do I need to do? Grace allows us to address this in new ways, to recognize this and to reverse it. That is something that I think that I want us all to take away. And we need to know grace, not just for the spiritual impact it has, but because it equips us to live as people of justice and compassion in this world. Grace does things. It does work. It equips people. And all of us, no matter what aisle or what political spectrum or spiritual spectrum, we need to hear this. The spiritualists out there who are all about, the spiritual things, we have to realize grace is given to us not just to heal our hearts, but to equip us with the spiritual armor and also with the emotional well-being to ask tough questions of ourselves in the world. Grace is there so that we might live more like Jesus in the world. And for the justice people out there and the people who are doing work in the community, you have to realize that yelling people is never going to get the job done. Your guilt and your shaming of people is not going to change anyone in the same way that it didn't change you. The most transformative thing, the most transformative tool that we will ever have that truly reflects the ways in the kingdom of God is grace. If you want to be able to address the privilege in your life, then you need to know your identity in grace. If you want to transform someone else and help them to identify the privilege in their lives without destroying them, teach them about grace. Teach them that their identity and their value is not in what they do. It's in the fact that they are beloved of God, no matter what they do. Grace is for all of us to equip us to do what God has called us to do. I pray and I hope that we'll go deeper with this, that we will explore grace, not just as something that helps our heart, but something that helps us to live in the world as well. Let's pray. God, that's my prayer. My prayer is help us to know grace, to go deeper with it. And how many have heard sermon series about this and about grace and knowing grace? God, help us to go further in what it does. That grace gives us such well-being and such identity that nothing can touch us. No accusation, no realization, no understanding of ourselves, even if it might be difficult, can touch our identity if it's found in grace. Help us to know grace, that we might be able to go into the toughest places and to shed the light of Jesus there to all that we meet. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.